For 30 years, Johnny Carson didn't just host a television show. He ran a kingdom. The Tonight Show was the most powerful platform in American entertainment, and Carson sat on its throne with absolute authority. One appearance on that stage could transform an unknown comedian into a household name overnight. Careers were built in those 90, later 60 minutes under the studio lights of NBC. Hollywood's biggest stars counted themselves lucky just to get a seat on that couch. But what Carson could give, he could just as easily take away. And for one woman who had practically built her entire career standing beside him, one decision, one single devastating choice, ended everything between them forever. She was never allowed back on The Tonight Show after this. And the story of how it happened is far more complicated, far more painful, and far more human than most people ever knew. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what Joan Rivers and Johnny Carson meant to each other professionally. Before Rivers became the sharp-tongued, red carpet-dominating comedy legend the world came to know, she was a struggling comedian grinding through small clubs in New York, barely making ends meet, convinced more than once that she should quit altogether. Her style was raw, confessional, and unapologetically bold. A woman talking about herself and the world around her in ways that made audiences deeply uncomfortable before they burst into uncontrollable laughter. Carson first noticed her in the mid-1960s, and what he saw was unmistakable talent. He invited her onto The Tonight Show, and that first appearance changed the entire trajectory of her life. When she walked off that stage, she wasn't the same woman who had walked on. Carson had essentially pointed at Joan Rivers and told all of America, this one matters. Pay attention. In a business dominated by men, where female comedians were often treated as novelties rather than headliners, that endorsement from the most powerful man in late-night television was worth more than any contract, any agent, any club booking could ever provide. Their professional relationship deepened over the years into something that looked, from the outside, almost like genuine friendship. Rivers became a frequent Tonight Show guest, her appearances reliably producing some of the funniest, most electric television of any given season. The chemistry between them was natural and effortless. Carson laughed, genuinely laughed, at her material, and for a comedian, there is no greater validation than making the host forget he's on television. By the early 1980s, Rivers had grown into the role of permanent guest host, sitting in Carson's chair on the nights he wasn't there, carrying the show with full confidence. She credited him publicly and repeatedly. She called him her mentor. Some went further and called him the reason she had a career at all. By 1986, Joan Rivers was at the height of her powers. She was famous, in demand, critically recognized, and beloved by audiences. But she was also painfully aware of something that kept her up at night. She was still, fundamentally, a guest in someone else's house. The Tonight Show was Carson's show. The guest host chair was borrowed, never owned. And Rivers, who had spent decades building her name from nothing, wanted something of her own. When Fox Broadcasting came to her with an offer, her own late-night show, her name above the title, her vision on screen every night, it was a kind of opportunity that doesn't arrive twice. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers would make her the first woman ever to host a network late-night talk show. It was historic. It was significant. And for Rivers personally, after everything she had worked for and sacrificed, it felt like the moment her entire career had been building toward. But there was a problem, a serious one. She didn't tell Johnny first. Whether this was a strategic calculation, a failure of nerve, or simply poor advice from the people around her, Rivers made the announcement without giving Carson any advance warning. He found out the way the rest of America did, through the press. For a man who valued loyalty above almost everything else, who had elevated Rivers from relative obscurity and trusted her with his own stage, this felt like a profound and unforgivable betrayal. It wasn't simply that she was leaving to host a competing show. Plenty of people left NBC for other opportunities. It was that she hadn't respected him enough, or so he believed, to look him in the eye and tell him first. Carson's reaction was immediate and total. He cut her off completely. Not quietly, not diplomatically, completely. Rivers was banned from The Tonight Show, and the message was made clear to the broader industry that appearing on her new Fox program would not be looked upon favorably by Carson or his team. For a community of comedians and entertainers who depended on Tonight Show access for their careers, that signal carried enormous weight. Rivers found herself suddenly isolated at the very moment she should have been celebrating the biggest professional achievement of her life. What followed was one of the saddest chapters in Hollywood history. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers launched with genuine excitement and strong initial interest, but the obstacles it faced were immense. Fox was still a fledgling network without the infrastructure or affiliate reach of NBC. The show struggled to find its footing. Behind the scenes, Rivers' marriage to producer Edgar Rosenberg, who had been deeply involved in the Fox deal and its execution, was deteriorating under the pressure. Less than a year after the show launched, Rivers was fired from her own program, fired from a show that bore her name. Months later, Edgar Rosenberg died by suicide. Rivers faced grief, professional humiliation, and financial strain all at once. And through all of it, the door at The Tonight Show remained firmly shut. She later spoke openly about her attempts to reach out to Carson, to explain her side of the story, to apologize if an apology was what was needed. He never responded. Not once. Not a phone call, not a letter, not an acknowledgement of any kind. For a woman who had genuinely loved and admired him, who credited him as the most important professional relationship of her career, the silence was its own kind of devastation. Those who knew Carson well described his capacity for holding grudges as one of the least flattering aspects of an otherwise remarkable man. He was not someone who forgot. He was not someone who forgave easily, if at all. The warmth he projected so effortlessly on camera existed alongside a colder, harder private personality that could close off entirely when he felt wronged. Rivers had crossed a line he considered sacred, loyalty, and in his mind, that crossing could not be undone regardless of circumstances or explanations. Rivers was not the only person to experience Carson's absolute authority over who was welcome and who was not. His show's history is dotted with figures who discovered, often without clear explanation, that their invitations had simply stopped coming. The comedian Rich Little, whose impressions of Carson were so precise and so frequently performed that they became something of a signature act, found himself quietly frozen out by the early 1980s. Little had performed his Carson impression everywhere, at clubs, at award shows, even on The Tonight Show itself, while Carson sat watching. At first, Carson seemed to take it in good humor, but underneath the surface, reports suggested he deeply disliked being imitated, particularly when the imitation carried any edge of mockery. His producers suggested Little's act had simply grown stale. Little himself believed otherwise. Either way, the booking stopped and they didn't resume. Dana Carvey ran into a similar wall from a different direction. His impressions on Saturday Night Live had made him one of the most celebrated comedians of his generation, but a sketch portraying Carson as an aging, out-of-touch host who desperately wanted to seem relevant did not go over well with its subject. When Carvey appeared on The Tonight Show and performed the impression directly in front of Carson, the relationship effectively ended on the spot. The ban held even when Carvey had legitimate promotional reasons to appear. Even the massive cultural moment of Wayne's World couldn't get him back through those doors while Carson was still in charge. What these stories reveal, taken together, is a portrait of a man who understood power and wielded it deliberately. The Tonight Show was not simply a television program. It was a system of relationships, obligations, and unspoken rules. Carson had built that system over 3 decades, and he expected everyone operating within it to understand what was required. Loyalty, respect, no surprises. When those expectations were violated, Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show on May 22, 1992, after 30 years as its host. He spent his final years in Malibu, largely withdrawn from public life, rarely granting interviews, and almost never making public appearances. He died in January 2005 at the age of 79. Joan Rivers never stopped talking about him, not out of bitterness, or not only out of bitterness, but because he remained, until the end of her own life, the person who had changed everything for her. She described the loss of their friendship as one of the great wounds of her professional life, something that never entirely healed. She acknowledged freely that the way she had handled the Fox situation had been wrong, that she should have gone to him first, that she owed him that conversation regardless of what his response might have been. But acknowledgement came too late for it to matter between them directly. He was gone before any reconciliation could occur. It wasn't until 2014, when Jimmy Fallon took over The Tonight Show and invited Rivers onto the program, that the institutional ban was finally lifted. Rivers appeared on the show that had once defined her career, the show from whose stage she had been exiled for nearly 3 decades, and the moment carried a weight that both she and the audience clearly felt. It was not a restoration of what had been lost. That was impossible. It was something smaller and more bittersweet, an acknowledgement that time had passed, that the story wasn't entirely what it had seemed in the heat of 1986, and that her place in the history of that show was real and undeniable regardless of how things had ended. Joan Rivers died later that same year in September 2014 from complications during a medical procedure. She was 81 years old. The reconciliation with The Tonight Show, such as it was, had come just in time. The story of Joan Rivers and Johnny Carson is, at its core, a story about the price of ambition and the cost of pride on both sides. Rivers wanted something that was rightfully hers to want. Carson expected something that was entirely reasonable for him to expect. In the space between those two legitimate truths, a 30-year friendship and professional partnership collapsed into silence that lasted until death made any other resolution impossible. Carson was a genius at what he did. He was also, by his own admission, not always a man who handled the personal side of life with the same grace he brought to the professional. His Tonight Show was a masterpiece. His capacity for forgiveness was considerably more limited. Joan Rivers was one of the funniest, most resilient, most groundbreaking performers in the history of American comedy. She was also, in that one pivotal moment, someone who made a choice without thinking carefully enough about what it would cost. The door stayed shut for 28 years. And by the time it finally opened again, the two people whose story had closed it were both gone, one in retirement, one forever. What remains is the television, the laughter, and the complicated, all-too-human story behind it. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.